Hello and welcome back to Cisco Knowledge Base. This is Zach from Content Security Team. Today we'll be discussing a new topic. With the 8.50 release, we have introduced a new functionality, and this one is called Steps to Configure Machine ID Base Authentication. So up until this point, historically, Web Security Appliance can authenticate based on IP address, user agent, or exempt for that matter. This new functionality will allow administrator to use the Machine ID Base Authentication or exempt auth. So as for the user guide and detailed specification for config and which release will be available, it will be posted once it's publicly available on either the early release or with the general availability. The configuring for Machine ID Base will be, the functionality was introduced in version 8.50, 390 build or higher. So as for the user guide information, once this is available publicly or early deployment, it will be posted as with all the other documentation as today for all the user guides, and new documentation announcement will come down here, and that's will be reside permanent basis. So today we see 8.05, 8.06, and that will be as a new document for user guide will come in as an 8.5 release. So let's dive into exactly what this functionality is and what it can allow administrator to work through it. So clients and user usually identify themselves historically with an IP addresses, or you can do by subnet or by user agent. Now we can identify as a machine ID and tie in with the group. So this supported functionality requires the Active Directory realm at this point. So what is the machine ID? Essentially, machine ID, if you look at the computer account and properties, it will give you under system information the NetBIOS name, also known as. So machine ID is also known as a NetBIOS name. On the Mac client, we can look at under Application, Utility folder, and System Profile. So on Windows, this is one of the Windows server. We can take a look at that on the computer. Properties. In this case, this is the computer name right here, and that's my machine ID. Apart from all full domain name will have a prefix as a machine ID dot domain name, but machine ID alone is WIN-Victor Victor JIP ID03JOA. On the Mac client, if you are interested to see machine ID, there's several ways to look at it. The quickest way would be going under Application, then Utility, System Information. Once it opens up, it brings you down under Software, and that's where the machine ID will be looking at. We can also look at the terminal, or if you open a terminal quickly, and that will pop that machine ID as well as a CLI. So continuing on, what are the configuration steps? One thing to point out before we dove into that, Machine ID Base Authentication is currently only supported and designed for connector mode only. What's that mean is the Web Security Appliance are deployed in a connector mode will be supported. So if you look at the appliance, this is the one it deployed in a connector mode. Under Reporting and System Status, it will give you the web proxy status. That's where it will describe Cloud Web Security Connector mode. So if I have a standard proxy mode deployment, I believe I have one of the machine here. This under Reporting and System Status, you will also see there's a lot of other parameters available in the web proxy mode. In here, the web proxy status is enabled as opposed to a connector mode on the first one. So that's what it means. It has to be in the connector mode. These are the steps to configure. We enable machine identification. Then we'll go under create an identity, just like we do today. But in this case, will be network and edit machine identification. Then we create, after creating identity, we can create machine groups and machine IDs added into the identity. And we'll do one. That will probably make more sense. After that, we'll configure the cloud connector setting and then cloud routing policy. There are several options available. You can drop it, you can have it go direct, or you can go through the cloud routing policy, meaning upstream scan safe tower, Cisco scan safe towers. So these transactions are logged in currently with the out log, UDS log, and connector log. So in order to see these, you gotta change the mode into trace level, and it gives you more detail. One note that I added here is then highlighted. On the Active Directory server, computer folder must have the machine or computer name added to this work correctly. So what exactly that means is, if in here, this is my Active Directory server, under Admin Tool, User and Computer, under Computer Bucket, for my testing I have added one of these machines. So the cloud-CWS is the Web Security Appliance that have joined the domain, and this is the machine ID for the test client. So that's what is referred to. So in order for machine to be identified, the machine ID must be added on the computer folder into the Active Directory, and also configure on the identity. And again, once we run through these steps, will make much more sense. So for the troubleshooting, there are a couple of custom fields can be added, %Z lowercase and %Z uppercase. This would give you information for the groups and also the machine ID in the access log. Very useful when we're troubleshooting. So again, this Windows client and the Mac client. And another useful command when we do whoami scansafe.net, who gives you the detail in terms of what machine ID is, what's your local ID, and what's your public ID, IP addresses, and so on and so forth. And we can actually take a look at it. This is my test client. So http://www.whoami.scansafe.net. It tells me my NTLM. This is a local user that created on the Active Directory server. That's my Web Security Appliance release that's running on. This is my external IP, and this is my internal IP. And that's, again, machine ID name. If the groups are added, it will display here as well. And then NTLM and then user ID. Okay. So the command from a local Linux machines that are in the local network, NB lookup command, all it does is program to resolve the NetBIOS name into IP address. So NetBIOS name, it maps the NetBIOS name into the IP address. So in this case, my NetBIOS name is this machine name right here, and it maps with this IP address. And this is for the second instant. So possible cause use cases that administrator can be use these functionality effectively. The administrator wants some machines to be identified with a unique name and some machine with authenticated users. Or it could be also used to identify as a NetBIOS name and apply different actions. It could be lower or higher privileges in case of servers or updates, exempt authentication, so on and so forth. Admin can also choose to direct traffic to the internet and forward either to drop it or have them go direct. If there are machines that do not have an antivirus patches on the local machine, NetBIOS name easily can be used, or machine name easily can be used to identify those and do a local policy. Number 5, there could be a machine that have joined the domain but not a user logged into NetBIOS name. So that could have a different policy. So it's all depend on the environment and use case on the local computer network. Additionally, admin may want to use a different privilege level for different machine groups. So I can put and group together the machines 1 to 10 in their location wise and have them a different policy by region. Some of the caveats. With the Machine ID Base Authentication functionality, again, it works only for connector mode and AD realm only. Machines cannot be divided based on the IP address because the machine can be moved, but the IP address will change. So that will change the ball game. So basically what we're saying is the machine ID, if I have a different IP addresses, that can play a part. NetBIOS approach is used to obtain a unique machine ID. And again, NetBIOS name is a 16 byte. This is just the RFC standard. And WSA performs on the back end when the request comes in NMB lookup. An NMB lookup command with an IP with a -A, as we saw earlier here, -A and the IP address. All it's doing is creating a mapping between NetBIOS name and into an IP address. It's a computer name or workstation name, as we saw. In the event of workstation has multiple name, and that can happen, some special case scenario where WSA will pick the very first NetBIOS name, just to some basic ground rules to avoid the confusion. And there are some access logs, and we'll take a look at it once we configure through it. So let's go back on the top. We'll start looking from the config, enabling machine identification. So we'll look at our config here. This is a machine that I'm running 8.5.0390 release. That is the release that support machine-based ID authentication. And what we'll do is we'll follow our own notes here. We'll go under network, edit machine identification, network, machine ID services. And here, what we need to edit is the machine identification and the NetBIOS, our AD realm. So I have a couple of realms that I've configured. Currently I'm testing with the Windows 2008 and TLM. Failure handling, and this is the policy based on what the local company requirements are. In my case, I had to continue applying policies which do not require machine ID. So it means keep processing the request, try to do the best effort instead of dropping it. Once we set up that, then we go in and create identity, just like we do it today, but there's a new available options there. Go under Web Security Manager, Identity, Identity, Add Identity. So what I have done here, I have created an identity called Machine-Based Identity. We'll make it clear here. Okay. So in this case, all we have is standard machine-based identity. That's just a free text name. From the drop-down, I have defined user authentication policy based on machine ID. If you look at from drop-down, either yes or no. So in this case, then machine groups. So here I can add the groups just by double-clicking in here to add any group for my Active Directory realm. For the demo purpose, I have only 3 AD domains. groups: administrators, domain users, and guests. Machine ID, and that's where you enter the machine IDs that you are either testing with or you want to create a certain policy. There are great examples on the bottom how you set up these. You separate it by comma. You can, but you don't need to require a domain ID, but enough machine ID is good enough. And as we looked at the machine ID in the Windows machine, the simpler way to see it on Windows client, just ipconfig all, and NetBIOS name is also known as a host name, and this is my machine ID. So in this case, I have added machine ID here from this Windows 2008 server itself. Okay, and one more additional. Okay, once this is done, this is also can be done either disabling authentication or enabling authentication. In my case, I have authentication enabled, and I'm using Windows 2008 R2 NTLM. And for selecting the scheme, I have NTLM MSSP or basic as a fall-off. So let's look at our notes. So once we create this identity, then we need to go in the Cloud Connector setting and configure the cloud policy groups. So under Network, Cloud Connector. Network, Cloud Connector. Cloud Connector setting, when we initially deploy a machine, a web security appliance in the Cloud Connector, we should have at least one tower defined here. In my case, I have a proxy 32, and for failure handling to drop the connection, and I can additionally have authentication enabled if need be with the authorization key. So that is required, at least one. These are the group policy directory group that we configured earlier over here. So these are the groups, and these are the machine groups, and these are the user groups. So they are two different. Okay, let's look at our notes. Once these groups are configured, then we need to go and configure our cloud routing policy under Web Security Manager, Cloud Routing Policy, NetBIOS. So we said Web Security Manager and Cloud Routing Policy. Web Security Manager, Cloud Routing Policy. And this is exactly the same way when we do access policy in a proxy mode. But in this case, we are using, if we also notice, there are no access policy or decryption policy option in the Cloud Connector mode. In here, I've created a machine-based policy just to keep things simple. And after the name given, I have tied that policy, machine-based policy, with the identity that created earlier for machine-based. Then I can either select the groups of users or all of them in this case. Once you configure that, then here's the routing decision, and this is the most critical part. Under routing decision, I have several options. So I can create a set of machine ID based authentication or exempt authentication. Then either I drop it, have no access, or I can have a direct connection. So just to avoid any delays or any trusted machine in the network, we know they are fully patched and do not need to go through the proxy servers. Or I can have go through the Cloud Web Security Proxy, which is the scan tower as the next hub. And in each instant, when we look at the access log transaction, it will be different. So by looking at the access log transaction in each event, I can tell which policy was used. Was it a drop? Was it a direct connection? Or was it a cloud web security or default setting? Okay, so that's all the config part that it requires. So this is all the config is done. These are all we said was the auth log, UDS log, and connector log will show the transaction. And this must need to happen in the computer folder. Custom log field, and we have done that, %Z, small case and uppercase. So let's look at the system administration log subscription. In this case we said was the access log. Here's the access log. Custom field option, I have a %Z, spice, %Z. So this way it covers both. One for the group and one for the ID. Once I do all that and I start sending some traffic, I should be able to see some logs. So let's do that next. So this is the command line, and we are capturing currently here access log. So we'll go to www.cisco.com to refresh that page, and just so to point it out, this test has been done, an explicit test. Connection, LAN setting, and I'm pointing to Web Security Appliance that is deployed in a connector mode explicitly here. So these are my access log, and just to make it simple, probably we'll break it down here and Control C. Scroll up. So as we see that first it was the authentication, 407 because in explicit mode, and since we already have given the auth and tested it, so that's why it came up and provided this. If you look at here, this transaction, so if you read here, everything else is a standard IP address, HTTP response code, www.cisco.com website. Here is my NTLM. This is my Active Directory. The user that I have created on the Active Directory service called Machine User 1, just for testing, is my AD full name. And if I'm looking at it now, it says parent proxy scansaves.net. What does that mean is it went to the cloud web security policy. And furthermore, here's my machine ID and machine base policy. So just to look at a little bit deeper, it's probably be easier to read it here. Here are some of the logs that I have traced prior to this. So if we look at the very first one, the cloud routing policy I was set to drop, and this is the one as we were discussing earlier under Web Security Manager, cloud routing policy. Here I have an option to either, as we were saying, to drop direct connection or cloud web security. So in my first test I have set to drop. What I want to point it out is to what you're going to see as soon as you set to this to drop. You'll see block admin. This is the decision code, and my identity, my policy. If I conversely change that to direct connection, I'm going to see everything else the same, but I should see direct here, the keyword, and I still match my identity, my policy. Then I change it to Cloud Web Security. And if we look at it closely, now I see default parent. What does that mean is going to proxy32scansave.net that I have configured as a proxy server or as a Cloud Web Security server, my identity and my policy. And conversely, I also added the machine ID, small z, capital Z, so it logs my machine ID and the domain name. It tells me which machine ID. So if I have several, I can group them together, look at the report by machine ID, by location, whatnot. Then I went ahead, and these are without the authentication. I have identity at the time with no authentication. Then I have done with the authentication. The only difference that we will see is the domain name, my machine user 1, that's my actually user name, my identity, and my policy, both. So if I would look at this right off the bat by looking at the default underscore parent and the name of my Cloud Web Security, this tells me this policy was used, Cloud Web Security. Otherwise, if it's dropped, there'll be admin block. If it was a direct connection, that would say direct, just like over here. So I've captured several logs while I was testing, but bottom line is the same. This is the Mac client when it was testing. The Mac client ID was ZACSHAIK-M1. So this was added as a machine ID into the Active Directory server. So if we look at it earlier, actually that is not here. So on the Windows machine, users, under computer bucket, this is the Mac client actually was added under a computer object folder. And that's where we see when I was testing from Mac, pointing explicitly and authenticating, it come in as, and I was using administrator account in that case. So, and from the local administrator, default, parent, and all sort of different tests. But just to point it out, make sure when you're looking at it, it's going to be a default parent, like here, or direct, or drop admin. Auth log, connector log, and UDS log. So this has to be in the trace mode. And one piece of cautious warning that is a critical. Make sure once we're done with testing, changing from trace level, make sure we put it back to the info level. It puts a lot of log. So just to show you a gist of it, you go under log config, add it. So we'll test with the auth log, which is number 5. And as you see, this time is set to informational only. In order to get the detailed information, why is it failing, what is logging, it's got to be in the trace level, which is number 5. And most important part, to commit to it. Now we grab, in this case, auth log number 5. We'll just tail it. We'll go back to our test client. We'll just do Google this time. As we see how much information is floating in the trace level. A lot of information. So you see NTLM domain, NTLM space negotiation, client. It gives me the domain itself and then machine ID, and a lot of information that it can be quickly add it to this space. And so this is very important to make sure we can change it. So I will follow my own lead. We'll put it back and we'll commit. So same way what we did with the auth log, this also can be done with the connector log and the UDS log. So ntlm.domain.com, machine ID, we'll see this found in the table. This is the connector log information, UDS log. We'll see the machine ID with the IP address mapping. So if you see any conflict, the same IP is getting mapped with the multiple machine ID, that can be troubleshooted here as well. In addition, just like today we see with the auth cache will list those machine ID as well. Okay, logged out. Give it a moment to populate. And the auth cache, it will give you, if you want to list it, you will see everybody's logged in at the time, including the machine ID. We can search it by machine ID, we can list him, we can flush him. There's some references were added here with the NetBIOS. There's a great documentation just to kind of take a peek on the very first one. If you look at it, I think this is from Microsoft. NetBIOS suffix for 16 character of the NetBIOS name. This documentation goes in deep as to what information in NetBIOS logs, different systems, different computer names, if we want to see from different client perspectives. So great reference. So that covers this topic. And let's see, we'll do a quick review and then we'll wrap things up. So with the version 8.5390 build, we have functionality added. That's to configure Machine ID Base Authentication. Documentation will live here. These are the steps we can take a look at it. What's the machine ID for the Windows client or for the Mac client? These are the configuration steps that we went through. One critical part is to design. This is designed only for connector mode only. So this is a critical piece of information. Configuring is pretty straightforward. Transactions are logged into auth log, UDS log, and connector logs. This has to be done to look at it in the trace level. And all the machine ID must be added under computer object folder on the Active Directory server. For troubleshooting, we can add %z and %Z. So look at the groups. We'll look at the machine ID in the access logs when we're troubleshooting. One thing I think we did not check that it from any of the Linux client on the local network on a shell. We can run this command. It will give you the status of it. So let's run this. So in this case, the NB lookup we did with the -A flag, and this is the Active Directory server or also the test client. It gives you this machine ID and the details. So if we have tens of thousands in a network, or one of them is not working, if we are for some reason is not able to resolve NetBIOS name to an IP, that could be this problem number one, to make sure why. Is there a reachability issue? Is there a IP connectivity issue? Just a basic troubleshooting. These are some of the possible use cases. Bottom line is we can identify machine by machine ID and take a special action on it, on a group of it or individual basis. There are some caveats where must be taken in consideration when you're designing these. So in the event the workstation has multiple name, you will take the first NetBIOS name. It's a 16 bytes name. All it's doing it's resolving the NetBIOS name into an IP address and creating a mapping that way. These are some of the logs we looked at it. If my policy is set to drop, I will see these messages in the access log. If it's set to direct connection, I should see direct, going direct with an IP address. If I have access log set to Cloud Web Security, my policy is set to Cloud Web Security, then I should see default parent. So my next hop would be the default parent. And then access log with the authentication. So I'll see domain, and I'll see username, and rest of them standard IP address, the HTTP response code, whatnot. And one thing is also important to make sure we match our intended machine-based identity and the policy. All these logs, we talked about auth logs, connector logs, UDS log have to be in the trace level, auth cache as well, and some of the reference for NetBIOS. With that, thank you so much for joining today, and I know this presentation got a little bit larger than I have intended, but thanks again for your time. You have a great day, great afternoon, and great evening. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.